¿Qué tal? Bien.
In the last video, we went afar to the Asian steppes to explore the eras-long history between mankind and horses. We followed the ancient riders of the Caspian Sea and their forays through Anatolia to learn about an ancient game of many names, but of a single premise: Jedit, the game of Troy, el juego de las cañas. A primitive yet beloved game where teams of horsemen would throw javelins at each other. As a ritual, a military training, or an exhibition, this game would go on in history to become a favorite pastime of nobles and of kings. Welcome to the second part of this 3-episode video series about the Ritz games. Last time, our journey left us on the outskirts of the Roman era, in the vast lands of Hispania, and with sight of the coming Middle Ages. If you missed it, you can click in the link on top to go to that video so you don't miss anything. If you're ready, then stay with me, because today we continue our quest to light upon one of humanity's oldest games, and a reminder that our ancestors not only played with boards and dice, but also with weapons and armor. And horses. This is Ancient Gaming, and today we continue our quest about horse games through the ages. We have already seen how javelin games would develop, transform and travel throughout the shores of the Mediterranean, becoming a staple for horse games, exhibitions and cavalry training through the classical era. But the equestrian games would see major changes in the Middle Ages, and I'm talking, of course, of the jousting tournaments. These tournaments were born in 9th century AD during the time of the Carolingian emperors and would become a big hit among the different European kingdoms, like a really big hit. The amount of direct sources, references and imagery of these events is vast, to the point that jousting tournaments have become one of the most emblematic icons of the Middle Ages in all kinds of modern artistic representations of that time. It is here, however, where we lose sight of our javelin game, at least for a little while. See, jousting tournaments developed in parallel to the transformation of European cavalry, which by the early Middle Ages increasingly became heavy armored, and eventually evolved into the mounted knights we are all familiar with and have seen time and again in the movies. Long gone were the times where cavalry was meant to be light, swift, and agile. The medieval horseman's role was to provide shock value and pierce the enemy lines with brute force. And this is exactly what jousts were meant to be. A clash between two knights, fully covered in armor, a front charge without turning your back on the enemy, one of the core moral principles of the Christian knight. But the game of Troy did not disappear completely, and by the 9th century it was even practiced deep into continental Europe. We have one example of this in the historian Nithard, who wrote about a military game celebrated at Worms in 842 by Charles the Bold on the occasion of a meeting between Frank and German knights. Nithard recalls how Saxons, Gascons, Austrasians and Bretons flung themselves into a swift gallop, one against the other, armed with their spears and protected by their bucklers, a back and forth of flying javelins and equestrian prowess that very well resembles that of the Romans, the Greeks and the Asian folks before them. These competitions would serve as a precursor to the future jousting tournaments, and javelin games were far from dead. Moreover, Christians were not the only ones to preserve the unrecalled tradition of the steppe riders, and the game never truly died in the East either. In fact, it would only get stronger. Light cavalry was still a vital part of Muslim armies, and the Jedit continued to be actively practiced by the Turks, the steppe folks, and even in the Iberian Peninsula by the Muslims of Al-Andalus. And it is precisely here, between the fringes of Al-Andalus and the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, with both Moors and Christians would clash, but often coexist and learn from each other. The Juego de Cañas was finally born. It is not clear, though, if the game of Troy ever disappeared in Spain, as jousting terminology was often vague and could include different games on horseback. But it is fair to assume that, like in other European kingdoms, it had already started to decline. It would only be with the Muslim influence that the game would once again come to the spotlight. The first references we have of these games in medieval Spain date from the 12th century onwards, usually during celebrations, like the wedding of Ramón Berenguer IV with Petronila de Aragón, or the ones performed by the troops of Jaime II during the siege of Ceuta. The Juegos de Cañas could very well be a mix of both the Latin and the Muslim variant of the game, but it was nonetheless a product of its time. The first actual mention of the name Juego de Cañas comes from the Crónica del Condestable Don Miguel Lucas de Iranzo. We like long names. A chronicle written in the late 15th century, and that again talks about the game in occasion of the celebrations performed after a successful campaign against the Muslim kingdom of Granada. After that, the amount of references, mentions, and descriptions we have about the game are simply way too many to put here. But the most important is arguably the Tratado del Juego, written by Francisco de Alcocer in 1559. Here we have an extensive description of how the game was played, and all the equipment used in it. Mainly the shields and the spears, but also things like bets and rewards, and even the dangers that entailed the game. Apparently, the game could be quite brutal at times, but rarely deadly for the players. Francisco tells us the following. Some condemn them for mortal sin, because they say that there is a possible danger of death in them. But the experience teaches us the opposite, because if it is not due to some fortuitous event, or because those who play them neglect their defense and do not cover themselves well with the shield, by wonder someone dies or is injured in them. The Juegos de Cañas would continue to be played throughout all the modern era in Spain, but it is really during the reign of Felipe IV in the 17th century that the game would see its golden age. He was by far the biggest patron of the game, and it is in these times that the big games were performed, either as the main course or as a prequel to the bullfighting event. Even the king himself would participate sometimes. In fact, he liked it quite a lot. Like in the inauguration of the Parque del Buen Retiro, where he played and won alongside the Conde Duque de Olivares in the cañas celebrated for the occasion. As for the gameplay itself, it was pretty much what we have already seen here and in our last video. Two opposing groups of riders throwing in turns javelins to each other, with the most distinct feature compared to its predecessors being the use of the adarga, a shield covered in leather and of an oval shape. And I bet most of my Spanish audience are already familiar with this word, but either ignore its meaning or why it sounded familiar to them in the first place. In case you don't remember, it is because you have heard it many times. En un lugar de la Mancha, de cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme, no ha mucho que vivía un hidalgo de los de lanza en astillero, adarga antigua, rocín flaco y galgo corredor. But the main star of the show was, of course, the caña itself. The cañas could be of two kinds depending on the size and sometimes had different colors. The short cañas were called bordos and carried sand or placer counterweights for stability and momentum, and the long ones had a cross stick in the middle of the spear that allowed a better grip to be thrown with extra force. Anyway, the winner was that team which demonstrated the highest skill and prowess, mainly by hitting the opponent with the caña. But as it happened with other equestrian games, there was often not a clear or concrete score system, like, for example, in modern Jared. Arguably, the winner was often declared by the same spectators and organizers in a kind of popular claim similar to that of the corridas de toros, when the audience decides whether the torero is worthy of the bull's ears and tail by cheering and waving a piece of cloth. With time, however, the Juegos de Cañas, like many other great games before it, would end up disappearing. Probably due to the appearance of other less dangerous horse games, a lack of patronage, the fact that it was theoretically restricted to the nobility, and that bullfighting would end up displacing most equestrian events as an undisputed favorite for the Spaniards. The last Juegos de Cañas were celebrated in the early 20th century as part of the corridas de toros, and would remain forgotten ever since. But that was until now, because we're going to play the Juegos de Cañas ourselves. Not today, however, but in the last episode of this little video series. And as always, leave a like if you learned something new, and subscribe if you want to learn more about other old games and how to play them. And if you want to go that step further, share the video, that would really help out the channel. I'll see you guys in the last episode. Until the next time.